Well, hey guys, welcome to Hope Rescue Podcast. I'm Kimberly Scott. This is my awesome husband who's fighting a little flu bug apparently today.
Let me just say, here's the thing you should know. Anytime one of the kids gets sick, I feel like I'm going to get sick.
I know. So
right?
can I tell?
Well, you go ahead. You tell your story.
So, okay, well,
tell your story.
I'll
It's your
just say
story.
this. Our producer and I, we were laughing, chuckling together because anybody who's married, we all know that our husbands, they have incredible pain tolerance for things like chopping down trees,
Right.
severing an arm or a leg. But when it comes
Fighting battles.
to head colds or a flu bug, it's like they go into like the moaning and the groaning. So can I tell you something funny right now?
Yeah, go
Since
ahead.
you just
Can I stop you?
No, you can't. Literally just before this show is when you told me that you weren't feeling well. But Gracie, our daughter, our youngest that lives at home with us, she's been sick for the last couple days. And the first 24 hours, she's like, don't say anything because if you say something, Dad's going to get sick. So
I told her last night, I said, I'm beginning to, so we have this little secret going on with our daughter because I told her, I said, I don't want to say anything to Mom because she'll think I'm faking it.
Yeah. See, because
I'm not
we know
faking
you.
it.
We know you,
I got
Tim.
a little bit of a head
I
cold.
see you.
Maybe I just sympathize.
I think you do. You're very you're a high feeler for
that's
yourself
it.
and other
That's
people.
probably
Well,
it.
listen,
I think it comes from a good place.
we're in a parenting
now I've
series, and since I'm my husband's mother, as he calls me sometimes,
Do any of you guys have that problem?
I think that's a whole show.
Yeah, it's like, hey, and when you drive there, make sure you drive carefully. And then she goes, oh, and by the way, when you trim that tree, trim it from the bottom up. I'm like, what?
I
What do you
know.
do? If you want to do it yourself. That was one of the things we talked about in marriage.
I know.
Is that when somebody's going to do something, don't tell them how to do it.
It's hard.
We need therapy
It's
right
hard.
now.
So
Can we
I
talk?
think we are each other's therapists.
Yes,
so
for sure.
we're working it out. But
Right.
today we're on. So our first week in parenting, we talked about what your priorities are in parenting. Our second week was how do you develop your children's values, and
Yes.
today is
how to deal with negative or positive behavior. So how do you deal with consequences to behavior?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about that. But our talk really comes from Psalm 127. All of these on parenting. There's so many passages on parenting, especially in Proverbs, by the way. But Psalm 127 says, unless the Lord builds a house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxiety, anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Now that sounds great. The problem is we go, well, that's just general principle. No, it's very specific about parenting. Verse 3 says, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is his reward. So he's talking about don't be anxious. He give you sleep. Don't, watch over in vain unless the Lord builds a house. So all of those principles in verses 1 and 2 are applying to parenting. And then he says, blessed are those who have their quiver full of them, like these arrows. That's what children are in the hands of men and women. Mm-hmm. So as parents, we have some great instruction here. And we talked about that the last couple of episodes, but today we're going to talk about how do you deal with behaviors. So whether it's negative or positive, there's consequences to behavior. You need to have positive and negative controls in your children's life. So, for example, when they do positive things, if you don't reinforce that, you will fail to raise children that are going to be mature, responsible, and especially godly. And I'll say one of the things that we've tried to do with our children, when they do something of great value, we do praise them.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's very important to do that.
So let me just stop there for a second because I know from some of the things you shared with me from your childhood and in another family member's home that has shared with me about his childhood, there was an expectation very early on for not just acceptable grades, but perfection, like of A's or less. Now, they were not praised if they got that. they only heard from their parents, and I say they, maybe not you, but when you fail to meet the standard.
Yeah.
So that is not
That's a
positive.
problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem. In fact, our kids, they have varying qualities of grades academically.
Because here I am, coming down hard maybe on that position, and we didn't exactly raise doctors and nurses.
Well, no, they're. I mean,
but
you know,
they're solid people.
They're really good people. Not very sharp. Okay,
not
academically, no. Actually, they do.
They all excelled in academics once they owned it themselves.
Well, let's put it this: one of our sons, we'll leave it up to imagination, was not very good in high school.
Yes,
and did not
he
do
got
well.
An A in being anything
let's
social.
Let's not give any information beyond that. But then when he got into college,
oh my gosh,
it's like he got straight A's.
Yeah. That happened to several of them.
And these kids, all of them aren't lacking in intelligence. Sometimes they're lacking in motivation.
Right.
And anyway, so you can relate this through academics. You can relate it through sports. You can relate it through, and what I'd like to relate it through, and I think is going to be most helpful, is behavior. So when we talk about behavior, whether it's academic behavior, we don't ever have to tell our youngest child to do her homework.
She's the only one of 7, though.
Yeah,
she's the only one of 7.
She's like, I go, what are you doing? Can you watch this show with us? She goes, well, I'm doing my homework, so maybe we'll watch it later. And then she, 4 or 5 hours later.
4 hours later.
Yeah, so she's just one of those, and
we got 1 out of 7.
Yeah, which is
lucky us.
I mean, some of them did well as well. But anyway, but when you're talking about rebellion, and when you're talking about behaviors and rebelling against authority, how do you deal with that? When your children walk a different path than you, how do you deal with that? So, for example, if you're a Christian and you're raising children to be Christian men and women, and they seem to rebel against that and maybe walk away from that whole concept of following Jesus, how do you deal with that? Is that an issue for discipline? So when they're young, it's very important to deal with that. Your children are trying to find themselves in ways of control. So the first time this happens is in their 2s, when they hit the terrible 2s. Sometimes earlier. We got a grandson that has a little bit earlier.
Spicy.
Yeah, he's spicy. He's just a year old. He's just a little over a year. Yeah, he's kind of like, he takes a cup and he looks at it and he's like over it and he just throws it.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I absolutely love it. But anyway, we don't have to worry about it.
It's cute until it's 7 or 8.
When they do that when they're 25, that's a problem.
Exactly.
But how do you deal with these issues of discipline and at different stages? So we kind of want to break that down. The first thing we want to talk about is the different stages of growth of children, say those early toddler years, and then kind of pre-adolescence and adolescence. How do we deal with that? And then how do you deal with adult children? So
got 'em all.
let's kind of break that down.
All.
Where do we start with children, little children,
well,
toddlers and
so
such?
with toddlers and adolescents, I think first let me throw this in here. Every parent who has parented, been through it and is on the other side, would change some things that they did.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to say that I would certainly change some things. I've actually caught some really great tips from watching my daughter-in-law, Cassie.
Yeah,
parent.
she's a good
so
parent.
I grew up where...
It would have been great if we were
I
parents.
know.
As good
I
as
wish
her.
I could have been like her. I grew up with I think many of us did in my generation and yours, where before you even think if you're doing something that displeases a parent, you get a swat on the butt, right?
Right.
And so, and I'm not opposed to a swat on the butt if there's defiance, but I think that's too often a go-to out of frustration, impatience on the parent's part, and just trying to startle them to get their attention. And I've watched her creatively steer Valor away from and train him away from making bad decisions. And she'll say, no, Valor. And then when he goes after it, she'll say no and grab his hand and steer him away. And then she'll say, good choice. like it was his
It was
idea.
forced, but
good choice.
yeah.
No, but she's
Yeah, it's good.
reinforcing,
Yeah.
and I thought, man, I wish that I had done more of that. And not that I was the mom that ran around the house with the wooden spoon, but I'm not going to lie, we did have one, and it was named.
Yeah.
I don't remember her name. I'm sure the kids would of our wooden spoon. But so the goal is obviously in pre, like toddler zone is to just
Pre-adolescence.
protect them and to
Yeah.
teach them that if you do this plus this will mean you get hurt. So don't do that.
Yeah, let me kind of address this thing. People ask, is it okay to use corporal discipline or physical discipline, spanking? It is not okay to beat your children. Obviously, that's clear. You should not abuse your children. Spanking your child is a different thing. Now, you look at me and you go, okay, you're an old guy. You're old school. You're a boomer, so you believe in that. Listen, there are timeless principles that God has given to us. Let me give you a couple examples. Whoever spares the rod, and it's just that means a switch, that little branch that is used for spanking, hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. So he talks about using an inanimate object, whether it's a spoon or a paddle or whatever, to spank the child. The reason for that is that if you spank with your hand, that's the symbol of love.
Of blessing.
Yeah, and so they're going to be afraid of your hand. It's very important to use inanimate. Now, let me just say, if you don't spank your kids, I don't have a problem with that, and but I do believe that there are times where that teaches them. That's what God says. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but spanking or disciplining drives it far from them. So this idea of spanking a child or using corporal discipline is certainly a biblical concept. So there are a lot of kids that have grown up that were never spanked that turned out great.
My mom is one, believe it or not. She was
was-
never spanked by her
Were you
father.
spanked?
I was, but I will tell you this.
You turned out pretty good.
I actually remember as a child, and some of you who are parents know this with your own kids, like when I felt like there wasn't any like boundaries and I could push, I remember pushing to the point of wishing someone would draw the line for me. And usually that was a swat in the butt. And once it was dealt with, I felt almost relieved. Like, because at
over.
certain ages, you just push and but you long for someone to toe the line for you. So whatever the towing the line looks like for you as a parent, you just got to follow through. It's about consistency.
Yeah.
That's the key.
Here's the thing about discipline. Discipline is very important. When you're dealing with children that are pre-adolescent, they're younger than puberty. If they are at the point of puberty, they are too old to use any kind of corporal discipline.
I agree.
And again, let me just re-stress this. I know that a lot of our listeners do not believe in corporal discipline, spanking their kids.
Because they've been on the end of the abuse of that.
Yeah.
And there is that.
And yet, I think that for the most part, a lot of healthy parents have used it in a very loving way.
Right.
But here's what you need to understand. When you discipline your child, discipline always looks forward. You never punish your children. Here's how you know if you're punishing your child. If you're punishing your child when all you're doing is looking back without a view of the future, I'll explain that in a moment. But when you are looking back and using punitive ways, spanking your child because they did something, that's punishment. Punishment always looks back. Discipline always looks forward. When you spank a child or put them on timeout or whatever your method of discipline is, you've got to give them hope for the future. So whatever method of discipline you use, you need to point them to the future. Now, this is dealt with. This discipline has taken place. You have had a timeout. You had to spend time in your room. Solitary confinement seems a little painful to me. But anyway, so you have this timeout or whatever it is. Now that's over. Now, look, you know what to do for the future. So discipline always looks to the future. Punishment always looks back. And when you are thinking about revenge, when you discipline your children, you're punishing them. Yeah. When you're looking for their future alternative that is better than the past, you are disciplining them. So whatever method you use, make sure that you're looking and pointing them to the future.
And I'll just speak to that. I think the punishment part of that, coming in with anger and it pointing them to the past, it creates an environment of shame for the child instead of hope for the future. So I think you have to be very intentional to make it about discipline, and reminding your children, if you're in a faith-based home especially, we've all made mistakes. God forgives. I forgive you. And maybe they need to apologize and ask for forgiveness. Teach them in that moment.
Right.
But then from here on, this is over with. We're done. And I'm not going to beat you over the head with this for the next, several days. It's really important to let it go. Actually, let it go.
The older kids, I would say, look, this is over, and I will listen to what you have to say. If I bring this up again, you need to remind me it's over. Yeah. And I've actually had both of the older kids, Carrie and Michael, say to me, Dad, you said that was over. And I go, you know what? I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought that up. So especially Carrie was bold to say that. She would say, hey, Dad, you said that was over. It's very important. Now, here's what he says in Psalm 127. It is vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. And then he says, children are a heritage. The reason I bring that up right now is a lot of parents failed to discipline their children when they were young. And now that they're adolescent and older, they can't sleep. They're filled with anxiety because they're afraid. If you discipline your child properly, you cannot guarantee that they're going to walk properly and do the right thing as adults, but at least you've created an environment for them to mature and grow.
Yeah.
You can just give good input. You can't secure quality outcome.
Yeah.
And don't get too frustrated when your kids rebel. Eventually they'll come around.
Yeah, I think and almost expect that there's going to be a season of rebellion. Yeah. I think a lot of parents think if this plus this will equal this. And so if I keep doing these things, they'll never be that kid. And yet we've seen many times, many families that were just solid and raised their children the same. And there's one or two that just spiral, or sometimes all for a season. But the key is that you don't, lose heart, and that you continue with those principles and stay committed and faithful to that, because it is true that, you build that foundation and then they're going to come back around.
Yeah. So, all right, the adolescents, they finish adolescence childhood, and they come into adolescence. How do we change our behavior as parents and adjust to them?
So obviously through childhood and probably the beginning of adolescence, it's more about being disciplinarians. So we're creating the boundaries.
Right.
We enforce the boundaries for their lives to protect them, but also, to help the healthy boundaries for them to grow. And that's
a loving thing to do.
That is a loving thing to do.
Yeah, go ahead.
And we're called to that as parents. Now, going into adolescence, it's interesting. There's a shift that happens there where you're wearing kind of two hats. You're wearing like a mom and dad hat and a bit of a coach hat, because they're starting to exercise their independence. And as we know firsthand, you can give them a list of expectations and things you want them to do, but they will still sneak out at night and you won't know it.
Yeah. And if God is gracious to you, won't know it until they've already grown, and then you hear about it later, which happened to us many times. Right. But anyway, here's the neat thing of making that transition. The negative aspect, and then I'll get into the neat thing. The negative aspect is a lot of parents don't know how to change from disciplinarian to coach.
Right.
There are times where you have to discipline, but when you have a teenage child, and you treat them as though they're 4 or 5 years old, and you overly harshly discipline them, you are going to drive them into rebellion.
Right.
You need to coach them. Let them make mistakes. Yeah. One of the best coaches I ever had in basketball was a guy that said, I don't think that you're ready for this area, but I want you to be a forward, and you're going to make mistakes, and it's okay. Don't get frustrated. And just begin to learn how to enjoy that role. And he let me get in there and play forward. I had only played guard up until that time. So he was a smart coach because he was trying to train me not just for that one game or for that scrimmage. He was trying to train me for future quality playing.
Failing forward.
Failing forward,
Right.
exactly. And so your kids are going to mess up. You need to become a coach. And when they're in their adolescence, when they're teenagers, if you become an effective coach and you're not a helicopter coach, you're really there when they need you. And, sometimes that's 3 a.m.
Right.
Sometimes they're, can't sleep at night, and that's the best time to talk to them. I would say as a parent, you took this role on, you need to be ready to talk to those kids when they want to talk to you.
Well, and I think what's key is that knowing when to take off the disciplinarian hat and engage as a coach. And that comes from, honestly, building relationship with them through those years and through their failures of like a sense of camaraderie and a safety for them when they make their mistakes. Because I remember many times our children, when they went through those adolescent years and they did something or said something and they didn't need to tell us, but they felt compelled and they felt safe to be able to process that with us, knowing that we would steer them a certain direction, but that we wouldn't discipline them for it when they were being honest.
Yeah. So coaching looks like this. Coaching is where you have a teenager and they make a mistake. And instead of giving retribution or even some kind of discipline, is that you explain to them a better way to handle it.
Right.
And a better way to make decisions and so forth. Sometimes you have to discipline, but most of the time you're coaching.
Yeah.
Now they have arrived at adulthood. They're in their 20s. And
That's our favorite.
Yeah. And then
That in the baby stage.
so when they're in the adult,
Actually, that's not true. I told someone every stage that my kids went through, I kept thinking, I can't believe it's going to be any better than this. This is my favorite so far.
Yeah.
And then the next stage was my favorite so far. So
yeah, I like it when they're adults because
Yeah.
they're our friends. And that's
Right.
that switch. You went
Yeah.
from disciplinarian to coach, and now you're friend.
Yeah.
And you got to make sure that you don't discipline your adult children.
Right.
I remember one time, Carrie and I, she was in her 20s. Actually, she was pregnant with her first child.
Oh, wow.
And we were on a trip. We were in Europe. And I was scolding her because she made a decision about where we're going. She was the great planner, where we're going to go and what we're going to do. And I'm scolding her like she's a kid. She goes, "Dad, you can't scold me anymore. You can't. I'm not your child." I said, "You're still my child." And she goes, "Yeah, but I'm an adult." And I go, "You're right. Why am I doing this?" It's because I realized, I got to let go of that. That transition is really hard.
It is tough.
And she really didn't do anything wrong. She just had a different way of doing it.
Yeah.
And it was really about my control. And
Yeah.
so we laughed about it later. But it's very important to make those transitions,
Yeah.
childhood to adolescence to adulthood. And it actually breaks down even more than that, but we don't have time for that. But listen to this verse. I love this. This is Proverbs 29:17. You want to read it for us? Proverbs 29:17.
Here we
It's
go.
right here.
Discipline your son, and he will give you rest. He will give you delight to your heart.
So here's your motivation in disciplining your children, that they will give you rest.
Yeah.
That's number one. And number two, they will be delightful to you.
Yeah.
And it is so cool
It is.
to have family nights. We're family nights, which we have every week. And the kids all come and we just hang out, and it's such a beautiful thing.
And they're our friends and their
Yeah.
family, and yeah.
And I feel like disciplining them sometimes, but I don't.
Yeah.
So, but they are a delight. They give rest to us. We trust God for them. I think we'll always be a certain level of anxiety. We have sons that have been or are in the military. We have a son that's a police officer. And anytime in law enforcement, you worry about that.
You'll always have the middle of the night wake up sessions praying for your kids,
But
regardless of the age.
You trust where
Yes.
your discipline has taken them. And then you start hearing things like, when we hear about our kids and go, their work ethic or their attitude, or a boss says this or that. It's really kind of a cool thing. Listen, your goal in child rearing is not to survive. That's not the goal, because that's what a lot of parents do. I just want my children to obey me while they're teenagers. No, your goal needs to be to develop mature, responsible, and in our case, we're Christians, followers of Christ, is to produce godly adults.
Yep.
That
Faith-filled
really,
family.
yes,
Yeah.
and we're seeing the benefit of that. We sit in the backyard of this house with the boys, I do, and their friends, and we have a Bible study, and I listen to the questions, and I'm like, wow, this,
cool.
it's worked.
Yeah.
It's worked. It's really cool.
Yeah.
And anyway, so here's our desire for you. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about parenting, but we wanted you to get a hold of this concept of kind of the development of a child and how to change the way you gear your response, whether it's good or bad behavior. Always use positive and negative controls on your children. And remember, more positive is probably going to result in healthier kids. For every negative, there should be several positives. I need to remember that myself. So listen, hey, have a great week. We're going to be with you next week, and we're going to talk a little bit more about parenting, hoping you're enjoying this. If you have any questions, send us your questions. We would love it. You can find us at hoperescuepodcast.org. God bless. Have a great week.
Bye, guys.